Hello. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Farida Batamosi. I am a Black American woman with brown skin. I have black locks. I have Browdy Frankenstein earrings. I am wearing a top with blues and reds and whites with different patterns. In my background is a wall that is peach and a black leather thing, and then a window. And I am so excited to have you here for this amazing conversation. On behalf of Barnard College and Women in Hollywood, it is my honor to welcome you to the 11th Annual Athena Film Festival. This festival is dedicated to celebrating the stories of bold, courageous women leaders and the filmmakers who bring these stories to life. Thank you for joining us. This year's festival would not be possible without the support of our dedicated sponsors. Please join me in thanking Athena's founding sponsor, the Artemis Rising Foundation, and its CEO and founder, Regina K. Scully, whose visionary leadership makes our work possible. A special thank you as well to our premier level sponsor, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which shares our commitment to showcasing stories of women in science. To all of our sponsors, thank you for your commitment to challenging our culture to be more inclusive and inspiring audiences in the process. This year, we wanted to create something new and exciting to bring to our audience, so we created these 8 different program areas that we believe react and respond to our current moment. This conversation is part of our Imagining a New Future section. In this program, we recognize that this time has us all thinking about what the new normal will be, but it does not need to be a worry, but rather an opportunity for something better. The future is wide open. What will it look like? This panel, Creating Utopia, Science Fiction as a Model for Future Planning, definitely encapsulates the idea of imagining a new future, because science fiction creators imagine new futures all the time. I'm so excited for this conversation, and I'm very pleased to welcome our moderator, Angelique, who will be moderating this conversation. We'll introduce our panelists. Thank you very much. I'll pass it on to Angelique. Oh, you're muted, sorry.
Hi, I'm Angelique Roche. I have tan skin, blonde hair. I am sitting in front of a bookshelf. I am a professional moderator, but I'm also a nerd. I work as a consulting editor for comic books, as well as a pop culture and social media journalist within the field, and a producer in some of my work. And I'm really excited to be here with some incredible creatives who I'm going to let introduce themselves. So I'm going to go over to what is my right, which should be everybody's right. I'm going to go first, Jennifer.
Hey, I'm Jennifer Pong, Asian American woman, black hair and big round brown glasses and black and white top and sitting on a gray couch. I come from independent film. I made 2 features, both kind of sci-fi dramas. One was called Half-Life. The second one was called Advantageous. Advantageous can be seen on Netflix, and it's about a dystopian future and a mother and daughter surviving a dystopian future. And currently I'm working in a lot of film and television. Most recently, wrapping on a shoot of the Foundation series for Apple. Prior to that, I've worked in a lot of the superhero genre, including Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Stargirl, Cloak and Dagger. Go ahead, Angelique, you're also on mute.
The mute button is going to give me some new skills today, so please be patient with me. I'm not used to using it. All shows I'm very familiar with the superhero genre, so thank you so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate that. Next, we'll go on to Yatasha.
Hi, my name is Yatasha Womack. I have big, curly, dark hair. I'm wearing a turtleneck with lots of circles, orange and gray and blue. And I have a giant painting that's orange and yellow that I actually grew up with. Still trying to figure out what location that painting is actually depicting. I have not quite figured that out yet. But I'm a writer and a filmmaker, and I am most known for my book, Afrofuturism, the world of Black sci-fi and fantasy culture. I write Afrofuturist surrealist works. I have a graphic novel called Black Cube, That'll be coming out next year. And I am a filmmaker. My Afrofuturist work is a short film called The Love Letter to the Ancestors from Chicago, which looks at dance as a lens for deconstructing time and space. But I've also wrote a film called Couples Night, and I'm developing a sci-fi inspired series now.
That's amazing. And last but certainly not least, Diana.
Well, I mean, I'm so excited to be here right now. Been expecting this panel because even though I didn't know who were going to be here, I was expecting this wide, different type of women with different backgrounds. And well, my name is Daina Chaviano. I'm Cuban, living in Miami for 30 years almost. And I began writing science fiction and fantasy while I was living in Cuba. And now I am working with a mixture, hybridation of genres, mainly science fiction, fantasy, mythology. My last novel, Los Hijos de la Diosa Huracán, which is a child of the hurricane goddess, is a historical thriller with, it's the first novel in Cuba that dig in the indigenous Cuban past. As you know, Cuban, we are a mixture people, and I can tell you my skin looked like white. I have now my hair is short. I used to have a very long hair all my life, but now as I'm getting older, I prefer to have it, shorter. But even though I look like a white-skinned woman, well, mainly my ancestors come from different places in Europe, but I have in Taino, which is the indigenous ethnic group in Cuba. I have Taino and also some African blood. I did my 2 DNAs test, and I was so happy with the mixture that I have right now, because all my life I have been writing and exploring the different mythologies and cultures, and of course the African and the indigenous are very important for Cubans. We don't. I mean, sometimes I see some people discussing in other countries that you cannot. I mean, if you're white, you cannot talk about Black culture because you don't know your. And with indigenous people, it's the same. But we Cuban don't consider ourselves so much white or Black or whatever, but mixture. We are a mixture culture. We have mixture blood, and at least I am very proud of that mixture. So this is who I am, and all my books are like a mixture also of different perspective, points of view, cultures, mythology, and that's what I am.
I think that's such a perfect segue to what the idea is of science fiction, right? This concept of genres. There's speculative fiction, there's Afrofuturism, there's science fiction, there's pulp, there's all these different things that for most people who don't kind of play in this space, they kind of lump it in, right? So I'm going to ask the next question for a grain of salt, right? Because Afrofuturism is its own, speculative fiction is its own. When you look at the different genres that are put together, even the superhero genre is kind of its own. There are different spaces to play that all give like these places for imagination. For you, though, each one of you have done such cool work and such a fusion of works together. What brought each of you to the medium of what a lot of folks just kind of put together as science fiction? And I would love for you to articulate specifically, your work in a particular genre and why it pulled you there. Why superhero? Why Afrofuturism? Why mythology? Why bringing these things together? Because I think that's also very important because we bring ourselves a lot of times to our work and to our creativity. I'm going to start off with Yatasha, actually.
It's interesting. The I think everyone has a relationship to time and space, and so cultures throughout time have always tried to deconstruct who are we in the universe, and what does this mean, and that essentially that really roots you in a otherworldliness. But while it seems otherworldly, it's simultaneously grounding, and because you're establishing this relationship you have with Earth and this larger relationship you have with the universe, and just trying to figure out your role in it. And so when I came across the term Afrofuturism, uh, it reflected a lot of who I already was, in that it interconnected, these histories and futures. It valued humanity, it valued intuition, it valued the experiences, the pantheon of experiences for at least the people of the African diaspora and continent. But it also sort of brought those particular relationships to time and space to light, and showed that there's a lived experience associated with those ideas. And so I was very much a kid who wanted to be a scientist coming up. I like comic books. I have this career day poster at one point of wanting to be a cartoonist. Um, and but growing up, history was really important. And it was, its history was important, and then the imagination was important, like this whole idea of creating your future. And I think I probably took a lot of that for granted, in that I assumed everyone felt comfortable shaping new futures. But as you kind of move forward, you realize that people think it's somewhat novel that you feel that you have agency. That it's like, oh, why do you feel you should um, have an idea about space travel? Or, oh, Black people think about space, and it's just like, who are you? Who am I talking to right now? And so, for me, but all at the same time, I'm recognizing that Afrofuturism is a lens. And when I really discovered the term, I chose to write about it, but I also recognized that it was a great way of connecting all the aspects of myself, and integrating them. All of my interests, where I could race back and forth through time, but probably most specifically, I wasn't limited. And sometimes when you're a person of color, you're kind of told that there's a certain kind of story that you're supposed to tell in a certain kind of way. And you're really limited in geography in some ways. And I just didn't want my characters to, even if they were in one space, I wanted them to be bigger than the space. They're bringing life to the space. I didn't want them to be limited to time. And I just have to say, that when Diana was mentioning, talking about, her Cuban heritage, I had experiences to really engage with a lot of Cuban artistic culture. And it opened up a window for me to think about Afrofuturism in other ways, and kind of freed me to think about more intensely dance as a lens to talk about Afrofuturism and identity. So I just want to share that.
I love that because I think that is the power for a lot of us in reading this medium, right? This ability and the idea of being able to dream bigger, to be able to see ourselves in a different way outside the construct. For you, Jennifer, you've done work across the board. Like for you, what brought and I love this, and I'm asking this question because I know all of you are brilliant people, and you could have chosen any other space to be in, because there are so many genres, there are so many places. Like for you, Jennifer, what brought you into this space?
Great question. I just thinking about it while Natasha was talking about, and just thinking about how when I lived in a big part of my childhood, I was living in Malaysia and had a lot of exposure to actually like English, British fantasy novels. One that comes to mind is something called The Enchanted Wood, which is about a bunch of kids who find a magical world at the top of this gigantic tree. And I remember being just kind of enraptured by the story. And I think what worked for me was that the kind of the idea of there being a better place to be, where everything is more beautiful and kind, um, and and you can get closer to what you want. There was literally a place where you could just go ask for something and get it. So I think something about the fantasy genre drew me in at first, but then my relationship with science fiction and fantasy evolved over time, of course. Another touchstone, this is a funny one for me, is Star Trek 4, the movie with the whales.
Yeah.
Do
Whoa,
you
I've
remember this
never heard
one?
anyone say Star Trek 4. Like that's
I
I
know.
mean, yes, it was great. It was very funny, and it was a caper where you stole a whale, for those who've not seen it. Basically, whales are the only creatures that can talk to the aliens. Right? Am I
Right.
remembering this correctly?
Totally.
So they
Totally
have to
right.
go back in time, get the whale, build an aquarium for the whale, and then bring the whale back to the future.
Correct. Precisely. Well summarized. So, I love whales. I also, live in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. So as a 12-year-old or however old I was when I watched that, it was a big deal. But it also opened up possibilities for me going, oh my gosh, look at the things we could do with space and time. And uh, then I went to college and I was exposed to Blade Runner for the first time. And that kind of somehow I was getting into poetry and expansive thought, just the idea of like the power of, I mean, just how we could capture human truths in different ways, and somehow Blade Runner did that in a way by portraying, having an existential eye on what it means to be human, and the value of human consciousness, whether it's manufactured or supposedly biologically generated. So all that was really super fascinating, and because Blade Runner did such an amazing job of like creating a world that I believe to be real and so transportive, it also kind of lured me in further. When we talk about the superhero genres, Superman and Supergirl, all these ideas, you're thinking of like, figures, people who are more empowered than we are, maybe, and have the ability to just do good and be pure. So this kind of mix of, ideals and escapism all kind of, work for me. And so when I look at what I've tried to do with my own personal work, with my independent films, and by the way, also when I was in college, I was kind of drawn into this idea of participating in our world actively to kind of create a better society as we can. So for me, it was just like, how can I do it all? How can I bring together something that I'm passionate about and with something that, like, how can I entertain myself while also playing a part in making a better world? So all that kind of funneled into making my work, which were family dramas that portrayed people who are more marginalized, brought to a science fiction drama genre issues of sexuality and acceptance and female identity, whatever, gender politics, all that stuff, and misogyny. So now my most recent feature, Advantageous, looked at the future of women and how women were valued in society. So I don't know if that answers your question, but basically, I absorbed a lot, and I just kind of regurgitated what I observed through the genre that I loved.
But I love that, right? Because that really is the lived experience of a creative, and I think it's a perfect segue kind of to our next question. And I would love for Diana if you could start off with it. This idea of, and I come from a very mixed heritage as well. Extremely from Louisiana, but family from Mexico, Germany, all over the place. And I think it's such an interesting thing when you have all of these inspirations that become this hodgepodge, and you create something new through that. So for you, Diana, like, what works do you turn to for inspirations? Or are there things like fantasy novels from your childhood, or books or movies that you picked up that you felt like inspired you to, in your work moving through your career?
Yes, well, in fact, I began writing fantasy and science fiction because when I was living in Cuba, there was like a decade where the government forbade the anything that has to do with fantasy and science fiction. I mean, you couldn't. They didn't uh, either in films or books, anything that has to do with fantasy, fairy tales, Disney, and science fiction. It was prohibited simply because they said that they were bourgeois type of thoughts and well, Cuban government has forbidden many things throughout the years, and I was so mad because I loved fairy tales. I was I have from Jules Verne to Ray Bradbury. I was beginning to discover all those writers. I was in my probably 9, 10 years old, and I began. It was like a kind of rebellion for me, and I began writing science fiction and fantasy. And then when the prohibition was lifted, because the Soviets at that time, the Soviet Union, began exporting some of his science fiction writers. So the Cuban government said, "Oh, well, this couldn't be so bad because the Soviets are, talking and writing and publishing science fiction." So they lifted the prohibition, and then that's. I mean, I keep on writing that type of literature that I love. But then I discovered that there were some things that I couldn't say out loud because I could be in real, uh, 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 I, I,
You could be in real trouble
yes,
because it was
that's a word
banned.
that I was, yes.
And yeah.
So I began using fantasy and mythology as tools, so I could say some things in a fantasy world that I couldn't say. If I was talking in a story that happens in Cuba or in some real place, and I could say certain things, if I knew that if I translate or extrapolate all that reality into a fantasy world and with alien characters, so they could they could I mean the censorship could allow
You
the
could get
book to
past the
pass.
censors. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
So that's
So you
how.
used your work as a rebellion.
Yes, at the beginning in Cuba, while I was living in Cuba, and it was a one. I think that my books were like bestsellers always because people understood what I was saying, even though they were disguised with aliens or sentient dinosaurs and things like that. But the people understood what I was saying. And in fact, when now that I'm in exile, many people still living in Cuba and others that are now in outside the country, they told me, "Oh, that book about the dinosaurs, or that this book about this or about that. I understood what you were saying." And it was my favorite book in Cuba. And they created like underground type of clubs to discuss
Book clubs, yeah.
those. Yes, so that was how I began in Cuba. But later on, when I was in exile, I didn't have to disguise anymore, the censors. So I began exploring my own culture, Cuban culture. But in order to do that, I didn't want to go only to the Spanish part of the culture. I wanted to explore the African and indigenous part, which I think was, and the Chinese. All that people don't know very much about the Chinese origins also of many Cubans. But there are these three ethnic groups: the people from Africa, mainly from Nigeria, and the indigenous, and the Chinese. And I have been writing books about those different cultures. And now I realize the alien element in my books, the fantasy and science fiction, comes from those cultures, because they are like, I see those ethnicities as kind of alien within the white, the mainstream white culture that has tried to either absorb or or um, or cover, I don't know the word for that, to cover those cultures, trying to hide those cultures, or the aspects of those cultures. So I'm working with the aliens, the alien element of science fiction and also fantasy, but trying to recover um, and to give more life to those ethnicities. That's what I'm
I love
doing right now.
I love that because it talks a lot about the allegory and the metaphor and the idea, but I think another thing, and I'm gonna go off script off these questions because now I have to ask everyone. There's this idea of, let's be very real, that science fiction at a certain point did not involve anyone that is on this panel. Just be very clear. It was not a space that was considered open to us. It is why it was such a groundbreaking thing for horror to exist. It is why people leaned into Octavia Butler. And I'm talking about American culture. I am not talking about other cultures. There are lots of other cultures that have examples of being a lot more progressive than cultures in the United States. But mainstream science fiction that we mainly know from the UK, that we mainly know from the US, not necessarily involved. Like, for instance, and I use Doctor Who as a great example, Bertie Lambert. People absolutely forget that the first producer of Doctor Who was a woman and the first director was a gay man of color. Like, people forget that consistently because what they see is the front person, who was an older cis white man, and the companions who were all white. And I say that to say there is this sort of defiance that I hear in all of your words. And not a defiance in like a bad way, defiance in a, how dare you say I don't exist in the future? How dare you say I can't be normalized and human? And for you, this idea of metaphor and allegory, which I love, is so reflective. And I would love to just kind of talk to each one of you because you create worlds. And not necessarily all utopias or dystopias. Sometimes it's the world and it's just a future and it just exists, and that in and of itself, to some folks, as you said, Yatasha, like, how dare you? But I feel like in a lot of the conversations it's, how dare I not? Why wouldn't I want to see a future for all of us? So I would love to kind of talk to each one of you, and please like bounce off of each other because I feel like there's so much synergy. You know, is it something, because some people go into it and say, oh, I'm creating this and we're going to normalize this, and some people are like, no, it's breathing, it's just what I do. And I want to kind of go over to Yatasha because Afrofuturism is that space, right? It's now become very, very, very popularized, but it's not new. It's relatively new, but it's not new. This idea of the existence, this idea of metaphor and allegory, this idea of what does it look like to see all people in the future? But like in your work, that's such a beautiful fusion. Like for you, how do you use this idea of resistance and creating world building in your work?
Yeah, well, it's a really special space to work in, actually. Initially, when I, started writing about Afrofuturism, I wrote about it. When I started writing my book, Afrofuturism, I started writing about it thinking of myself as covering a culture that I was tangentially a part of. Um, I was more part of it than I thought, but in the moment, I was almost looking at it like I'm a reporter, right? Kind of covering something. And then in the midst of it, I started having these story ideas. And it was the story idea for my Rayla 2212 book with a character who lives on another planet a few centuries into the future, and how she reclaimed her connection to Earth in order to sort of save her planet. But that experience of writing that story and thinking about those ideas, I got so excited about it. I started working on that story, and then I had to say, "Hey, stop! You have a book deal for another book." I mean, I went and actually launched an ebook version of the Rayla 2212, and I had a big website and all sorts of things. And then I went back to finishing my book. But that experience was necessary because Afrofuturism isn't just an artistic aesthetic; it's also a method and a practice. And so I really had to have this sort of creative experience where I was claiming my relationship to this subject matter, and not just looking at it as an outsider, because I think, at least for me, I'll say many people, to be honest with you, engage with the ideas of Afrofuturism. It's not the sort of thing you could just look at from the outside without in some way being drawn in. And that's okay, but it's certainly not something anyone expects in some respects. But with that, I just felt like, it was be interesting to talk to people, as the term Afrofuturism started to become a little more popular, or even initially. I mean, I remember, seeing a young artist and they were showing me some of their work, and it was very Afrofuturist. And they said, "Is this okay?" I said, "Well, what do you mean, is it okay?" They're like, "Well, would anyone want to see this?" And the images there were maybe somewhat similar to images, you could think about Black Panther, or you could think of maybe a more technological version of like African mask work. And I was like, of course, there's people who want to see this. And they were like, well, yeah, but would anyone want to buy it? And I just thought, wow, here's someone literally cutting off their talents and their ability to imagine something because they don't know if there's a marketplace for it, even if they're just creating it for themselves. And then beyond that, would anyone else like it besides them? And so for someone like him to see, hey, look, here's this book, Afrofuturism, what you're doing falls in that category. They can look and see, oh, wow, I connect to these cool people in the past. I connect to these people doing this work today. Some are in music, some are in art. Some aren't creatives at all. They just are advocates of futures that value humanity. And that, I think, was empowering. And so for me, there was just sort of this moment of realizing how many people felt like this term gave them permission to express sides of themselves that they didn't feel most of society wanted to see. And I didn't realize how extreme that was. Um, for many people. And so this was very freeing. One story I tell sometimes is about a guy I knew who was a art collector. And when I was working on my book, I told him I was, writing about Afrofuturism. And he said, "I hate Afrofuturism." And I was like, okay, well, gee, that's good to know.
Very
And,
strong opinion.
it was kind of like, people didn't hardly know the term, but he hated it, right? He was very firm about that. It's like, all right, well, fine. And then a year later, I bumped into him, and the book had just come out. He said, "Oh my God, I saw your book. It was in the bookstore." But here's the funny thing: I saw him waiting to see Samuel Delaney who is this titan of he's an African American science fiction writer, one of the first to have major recognition. And he was at an event to see him. I got there late, hoping I could at least wave to Samuel Delaney. And here this guy was. He was like, "Oh my God, I saw your book, and this is so great because I've been working on these ideas, or I think about these ideas, and I love Afrofuturism." And I was just thinking, here was a guy, and he was an elder, could have been, my parents' age. And I'm just thinking, how long did he live a life feeling he needed to deny these things? And, like deny these sides of himself because it wasn't practical or acceptable, or it wasn't valued, or you couldn't make money from it. What could he have contributed to the world of Afrofuturism that persons like myself and others could have built upon if he had felt somewhat validated in being able to express himself? So I sort of think about it in that lane, and I'm happy that people have taken to the term and it's inspired them in ways, because I just feel as a planet, we don't get the best from people when they feel that they can't contribute, and that they can't, that the lessons and wisdom from their lived experiences and their cultures aren't valued.
Love that. And I think that's also really interesting, Jennifer, in your work, because science fiction isn't all flying cars and dope clothes, and there are other lessons, right? There's relationships, there are interpersonal, and I think, in your independent work, but also like in the stuff that you've done for Cloak and Dagger, in the stuff that you've done for Supergirl, and the stuff like the your work in directing. And I think people always kind of forget, like, directors have so much power to help create the chemistry and the energy between characters. And I am a huge fan of there being this idea of, I don't want to say drama, but interpersonal relationships, right? Like, what does it mean to like be able to have that exist as well, right? Because I think when a lot of people think of science fiction, they think, oh, it's a mastermind taking over the world. We're going to the moon. Suddenly, apes are now inhabiting. I just watched the Planet of the Apes 9. Y'all just don't judge me. I just bought the 9 movie collection. Um, Suddenly we land, we're in a spaceship, humans can't speak. Like, it's but we never really think of these interpersonal connections. For you, how have you been able to bring kind of your love of fantasy and then bring it to this next level? Because I think there's a type of intimacy that you can create that doesn't also necessarily exist in all sci-fi or all superhero or all cultures. It's really important, right? Because it's almost like bringing humanness into science fiction and giving
Right.
your character so much more depth.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll even step farther back and say, like, I also am an Asian American filmmaker in addition to being a science fiction filmmaker. And so there's a whole other task that, for better or worse, I felt was foisted upon me, which was to humanize Asian Americans in the American lens, and it's so complicated. The Asian American identity is so complicated, and because, and I don't know, it's more or less complicated than any other identity, but I just can only speak from that seat and say, as someone whose father is Chinese Malaysian, mother's Vietnamese, and I was born in Berkeley, California, and I don't know how to speak Vietnamese or Mandarin in any normal, respectable way. Like, you kind of exist. I exist in this kind of weird, I'm totally blanking on the word I want to use, but basically I'm kind of in between everything. And so at the same time, there's this kind of need from the community to be seen as human, to be seen as people with experiences and strength. And but also it's complicated because you're also trying to cater to the kind of patriarchal, dominant, need from the majority, from the white majority. So it's this really weird position to be in, and I guess the happy place for me has always been just to be able to go, okay, perfect case in point is Advantageous, where we have a mother and daughter who are as human as can be. You know, they're actually going through an American experience of trying to survive and get into the best school and stay, you know, stay favorable in the lens of their community or the upper echelons of a futuristic society. So for what that's worth, that can be relatable. But I wanted their struggle to be real to as many people as possible. And so I kind of created them in this kind of upper middle class station in New York City, and still having the struggle because this mother had lost her job. So I guess to try to answer your question, it feels like, human stories are the stories that we connect with. Yes, grander. I mean, what I love about a lot of science fiction are things like, series like Black Mirror that do have that powerful allegory. But in a way, sometimes those stories can leave you cold if you don't really connect with anybody in the story, if you don't see yourself in them. And so that's for me always been important. And as a director, I feel like I've been discovering that my strengths are absolutely my humanity, and that and so to kind of like take a scene or take a script and say, okay, what's the actual human way to process these stories, these challenges, these obstacles for this character, and kind of help actors and all my key collaborators navigate that lens, navigate that story, and see it through a lens that has some sort of power or impact. Super abstract way of trying to express, what I'm trying to say. But the point is, yeah, I feel like there's nothing more valuable than understanding your character and seeing yourself in that character.
I love that because it does bring in this concept of representation and existence and what does it mean to have a place. And I think we've all kind of touched on that a little bit in our answers. And I think it's interesting because there's this one question that we have that I kind of skipped over, and I think it's kind of a perfect time to ask now, is this concept of utopia versus dystopia versus these big swath of ideas that exist, and this idea that utopias don't always include all persons. It doesn't, not everything is Star Trek. And Star Trek wasn't even Star Trek, let's be real. For you, do you think as world builders, right? As writers, as directors, as creators, do you even think that utopia is possible? And for you, what would a utopia look like? And what you can answer that whether personally or in your writing. There's not a trick question here. I will start off with Diana.
I think that with utopia, people think, first of all, utopia's books might be boring because there's no conflict. It's what many people think or might think. But in fact, any society, even the best of societies, has conflict. And at least what I've been doing is, I created my first utopia when in my last novel. I wasn't thinking in building a utopia, but the Children of the Hurricane Goddess it was going to be a historical thriller, and it is. Because it happens in two different times. One, during the Spanish conquest in Cuba, when the Spaniards encountered the first indigenous Cuban people, and the other one in the other plot happens in the near future, maybe 30, 40. It's an undetermined future. Now in Cuba. in a Cuba where they are going to make the first democratic elections in almost a century is going to is being prepared in Cuba. So the many people when they read the novel, they told me, "Well, you wrote a science fiction book because democratic elections in Cuba with so many parties. You know, there was the Green Party. I mean, there was different type of parties. This is science fiction." And so I realized, oh yes, you're right. And it is a sort of utopia because even though there is conflict, but the in comparing but in comparing this plot with what we have right now is a utopia. This is a utopia which is full of conflicts, but is a much better place than the place where we are now in Cuba. So what I'm doing now, I said I always hated dystopian novels because everything was so obscure and so depressing. But now it happens that I'm writing dystopian short stories. I'm preparing a book, but it's a different type of dystopian stories. I don't know how to classify that. It's sort of dystopian and utopian because I don't want. I mean, with this environment we have been living in for the last year, this COVID thing, I feel we are living right now in a dystopian world. So I said I cannot avoid this time. I have to say something about this, and I'm not talking about writing dystopian short stories about any type of epidemic or anything. It's a dystopian world. It has to do with the climatic, ecological subjects, but they are going to be dystopian stories with a utopian type of feeling and a utopian possibility. So it's because maybe it's because I'm a very optimistic person that I want to see that good things are going to happen at the end of the bad times. So that's what I'm trying to do right now. And it's funny because the alien, what we could call the alien characters, are very much uh, earth earthling. I mean, the aliens are us in this type of short story. So I think this times like this one that we are living in right now, and the utopian perspective is something that we have to face and to develop in some way, because people are. I mean, we as a society, as human beings, we cannot foresee a better future if we don't have better models, to follow. So we have, in some way, if you remember the Star Trek series when they began, the iPads that we have, the simultaneous translator, all these things were seen first in those TV series, and in many books, of course. There are many, and many scientists and engineers had said, "Well, I was inspired to do this because I read that book, I saw it in Star Trek," and many have worked about on those inventions from beginning with a science fiction book or series. So I think that in order to create a better world, we need to show and to develop some type of utopia. We have to try to develop this type of positive possible futures. And I don't know. It's something that because dystopians have been very very in vogue in the and during the last times, and I think it's time to look more for utopias models. Uh, I don't know. That's what I think.
Natasha, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree.
Are
I think
utopias
there's this.
possible? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, completely. Yeah, they're completely possible in storytelling. I actually play with worlds. Some of my writing has dealt with the idea of utopia. My Rayla 2212 series dealt with a utopian space society that was turned upside down, and people had to work to restore it. But there, even in that, once that's over, it becomes a quest of self discovery, and so you can still live this life, and there'll still be these tensions between people for one reason or another. But it doesn't mean it's inherently a dystopia. If people have access to food and water and shelter and are able to have agency in their lives, and so I think that and I think that's okay to think about futures in that way. I was part of a contest, and I had to judge a lot of the artwork, and it was for Swords Fall, which is a RPG game, and they had all these artists contribute work. They were all artists of color, most of whom were of African descent, and it was in the midst of the pandemic, and all of the images were of people going to clubs in the future, a barbecue in the future, a backyard gathering with friends in the future, a dad chef in the future. It was all of these things of people going out and enjoying their lives. And typically, when you look at a lot of futurist art, you rarely see families. It's sometimes it's gray and black and a lot of silver. It's very metallic. It's not all these patterns and colors, and certainly not a lot about people just hanging out or doing regular things. And I thought how interesting that was, that we're in this pandemic, which could be described as a dystopia, and people are creating images of what they would like to be doing. And in this moment, it's going out, hanging out with people. So I think that there's the idea, there's dystopia, there's utopia, and then there's just hope in a story. Can you create a way of hope? If you're taking your characters to the pits of obscurity and then you want to bring them into the light, so to speak, um, is there any hope in the story? And, what's the lesson? And to me, if the lesson is you can't change anything, all is lost, and to try is pointless, I don't think that's helping anyone. And clearly, people are writing things and they just want to express where they are. But there's a part of me that feels it's not just about you expressing yourself, there's also connecting with recognizing that people are finding inspiration in this work. They're getting lessons out of these works. They're playing in your imagination. And it's and just to express a tangent idea for a moment, even thinking in this period, as bizarre and horrendous as it has been, there are still moments where people are connecting, and there's community, and then there's the fact that we're doing this panel now. So even in what can be called a dystopia, you have utopian moments. You have moments of connectivity and hope. And when I think about just the experience of people of the African diaspora, now just say here in America, to whittle it down a bit, that has been what has helped move people forward. This idea of hope, this idea of there could be more, this idea of finding the good in the moment, and creating something, sharing what you can. I just saw images of dolls from the antebellum South that enslaved women created for the kids for either their children or kids on the plantation who are also enslaved. And in all of my contemplations of enslavement, I never thought about mothers, whether it was for their children or not, who were creating dolls. So you're in what's a literal hell, right? And here are women taking care of children that might not be their own, kids whose parents may have been sold off. And they're taking what material they can to make a doll and give it to the kids so they have some sense of humanity, even in a space where it's not being acknowledged by larger society. So, hope is not just this sort of futile thing that people throw out to spin and make people feel good about themselves. It has real world consequences. It can help someone move along, move to another day when they don't know why they should. And I think that when we're creatives, we should at least be cognizant of that. And because it's utopian to even be able to write your stories and create films and have anyone look at it. That is in some ways a utopian experience, and it's something for us to just be cognizant of.
Jennifer?
Oh, it's amazing to listen to Diana and Natasha speak so much beauty and truth. I mean, to these ideas. It reminds me of so many things. I just read Peripheral for the first time, the Gibson novel, and for better or worse, it what Diana said about the utopia, the utopic dystopia, the dystopia within the utopia, reminds me of just this idea that we're existing in a world where our reality is a utopia for some and a dystopia for others, and that is based on how much money we have in our pockets. It's just the reality, and it breaks the heart, and it's so true. And to the optimist in me does want to say the same thing that Utasha is saying, which is absolutely true. We're finding moments of beauty as we navigate one of the biggest crises of our lives, and we insist upon finding connection in spite of what could be just the most crushing evaluation of our existence. We insist upon finding love amongst each other, and I love that too. I personally have experienced one of the most utopic pandemics, in that I was helping to create a whole other reality in a COVID bubble on the island of the Canary Islands and in Malta and in Ireland, in the most protected circumstances one could imagine. And did I feel guilt? A little, but primarily just we were all going around just telling each other how lucky we were, and how privileged we were to be able to work during a pandemic. And I'm still recovering from that experience and going, what just happened? I'm still jet lagged. I just arrived back in Oakland, California. So I guess the surrealism that we're kind of existing inside is something I still have to come to terms with. I think that when I think of what a utopia should be or could be, or how I would want to portray one, it would be, a version of what I have done, which is seeing people of different, I'm going to say different backgrounds and identities, being able to treat each other with the respect that every one of us deserves, and just work together. It's a more grounded version of the Star Trek, in that we're truly working on something that matters together, and that is to lift us all. That would be the utopia, and I believe that there is work out there that does speak to these kinds of realities. Yes, it's really super easy to get caught up on the the trappings of the genre. But yeah, to me, utopia doesn't mean that that everything is perfect. Utopia is a place where we can work together better, and respect each other. And we're getting there. There are pockets around the world where that's happening. And if we can just kind of keep supporting those pockets and expanding them, that would be super cool. So
I love it.
I don't know. That's my just general response, but with great appreciation for what I'm hearing from Diana and Tasha, because I think that kind of hopefulness is actually the thing that kind of feeds us and keeps us going. Okay, we can do this. Let's present these images of what can be, and let's try to let's try to emulate that in our day to day.
I love it. And that's actually, and I hate to say these words, perfect way to sum up our last substantive question. The last question that I am going to ask for each one of you is, can you tell folks where to find you? I personally have already stalked you all on Twitter. You already have friends invites. You are very easy to find. But if you can let everybody know where to find you, but also, um, one thing that's bringing you comfort right now, if it's a book, if it's a blanket, if it's a movie, I have a particular playlist. Like, is there one thing for you? Because I think, Jennifer, you hit on it. I think everyone kind of hit on it. We're in this moment, right? Like, you can't ignore the moment. And, I just said I downloaded the 9 movie collection of the Planet of the Apes, starting in 1968. I did. I watched all of them this weekend. So, is there one thing for you that's bringing you comfort? And then where can folks find you? And we will actually start off with you, Jennifer.
Uh, I'm just gonna be honest. I'm kind of a nerd for puzzles and escape rooms, and so that's like kind of what I keep seeking out to just kind of take me to the next day. Just solve a puzzle, and you'll feel more confident about attacking the next thing. So that's my fun thing. But yeah, I'm easily discoverable. Jennifer T. Pong. Pong is spelled Phang, so Jennifer T. Phang on Instagram, or Pong Vantageous, which is Phang Vantageous, on Twitter.
I am a big fan of your Twitter name. Diana.
Okay. Well, uh, I always feel more comfortable here in my personal library, and my comfort are always books, and well, my cat, my
Hello.
Oh, hello.
oh,
It's like, don't forget me.
here. And I don't know, talking to my friends, my sister, which is in Mississippi right now, but we are very close, and that's it. I write. I keep on reading a lot. I have a lot of books that I have been. These are my gifts that I give myself, and just received them this week. And well, this is it. Um, I think, well, you can find me anywhere because I have the one the best thing of having a strange name and first name is that there's no more. If you write on Google Daina Chaviano, there's only one Daina Chaviano in the whole world. So you can find me either in well, my website, which is dainachaviano.com, is bilingual, by the way. You have it in English or Spanish. You can go clicking the on the flag. And I am in Twitter also, Daina Chaviano, in Instagram, Daina Chaviano, in Facebook. I'm very much active in Facebook. I have an author page, which is the like page, and you can ask me for friends. And I had to start a new one because my last personal account was hacked. So now I have space for more people. I already had in the old one the limit of 5,000, but I have space for new people. So you can find me anywhere you want. I'll be there.
Perfect. Perfect and on brand. I love it. And Yatasha.
Yeah, I've just been extra appreciative of everyone who's ever made music, made films, wrote books. Because I just found myself really, turning to these things for connectivity. I did a deep dive in Korean cinema, and was just completely transformed in a lot of ways, watching so many films. Myself and a friend of mine in New York, when things were first starting, we are like, okay, just to keep our head straight, we were going to watch a movie, like 3 movies a week, and we are going to call each other and discuss it, because we were both in this space of being isolated. And, so here we are, watching this world of cinema that neither of us had been familiar with at the time. And, we're discussing it, we're inspired by it, we're transformed by it. I'm listening to soul albums from the 70s I hadn't quite listened to before. There was a album Diana Ross did with Marvin Gaye. I don't think, I remember seeing the album, but I never listened to it. I was like, this album's beautiful. Um, and so, but essentially, it just seemed I had this appreciation for people who gave themselves to their art forms. And here, especially in the beginning when things were super tough, uh, being able to immerse myself in their art form, as it wasn't truly just an escape so much as a deep connectivity, to the human experience, and me just appreciating that people would give themselves in that way. And here, some of the people doing some of these works, I mean, some of them are alive, some of them are not, but they gave, and created something that I could find a value in a relatively unpredicted pandemic. And that's a win, for those artists and creatives who did that. So that's it. And if you want to follow me, there's Yatasha Womack. I don't think there's too many, but I'm on Twitter as Yatasha Womack, and on Instagram as Y Soul Star. And you can go to my website, yatashawomack.com.
Oh, that was amazing. I know that folks would love for this conversation to end, so hopefully folks will go and follow each one of these amazing, amazing, amazing creators because it's worth it. I have done it. So thank you all each for your time. This has been absolutely incredible. You can find me if anybody wants to look me up. It's literally my name at Twitter, Angelique Roche, and then Angelique Roche Official on Instagram. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.